The mahogany desk smelled like expensive cigars and my own sweat. My father didn't look at me. He just slid a piece of paper across the wood. It was an invoice for $1.2 million. He called it reimbursement for raising me. I reached for the door handle, but it was already locked from the outside. Then, his head of security stepped out of the shadows and reached for my throat. I have exactly 48 hours to pay, or my father sells that debt to a collection agency that doesn't use lawyers. They use crowbars. I thought my mentor, Robert, was coming to save me. Instead, he walked in with a restraining order and a smile. I'm currently standing in a remote cabin in the Maine woods. My mother just called to tell me she betrayed me. The inheritance is gone. There are blue lights flashing through the trees, and the police think I'm the one who stole the money. Let me take you back to where this began. The air in Lawrence Miller's office tasted of stale cigar smoke and expensive floor wax, a combination that always made Julian's lungs feel as though they were being coated in a thin layer of lead. He stood before the massive mahogany desk, his cuticles stinging as he gripped the polished grain. Across the dark wood, Lawrence leaned back in his leather chair, the springs emitting a rhythmic, metallic groan that sounded like a slow-motion execution. With a flick of a manicured finger, Lawrence slid a single sheet of paper forward. The black ink of the $1.2 million total shimmered under the halogen lamps, mocking Julian with its clinical precision. "The board has already seen the preliminary audit, Julian," Lawrence said, his voice a smooth, predatory purr. He straightened a fountain pen on his desk, ensuring it was perfectly parallel to the edge of the blotter. "It appears your signature is on every offshore transfer. A pity. I thought I raised you to be more careful with your math." Julian's collar tightened, the silk tie feeling like a noose. He swallowed against a dry throat, the scent of Lawrence's sandalwood cologne thickening the air like a physical barrier. He knew the numbers were a lie, a structural collapse engineered by the man who had taught him how to draw his first straight line. This wasn't just a debt. It was a demolition charge set at the base of his life. Lawrence wasn't asking for payment. He was announcing a seizure of assets, a calculated strike to strip Julian of his independence and the land his grandmother had left him. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed, a heavy brass toll that echoed off the leather-bound books, marking the first second of Julian's ruin. "You planted these discrepancies," Julian managed to say, his voice scraping against his throat like sandpaper. "You used my personal login while I was on site in Dubai. This isn't a debt, Dad. It's a heist." Lawrence didn't blink. He simply adjusted his cufflink, the gold glinting like a predator's eye. "Proof is a fickle thing, Julian. In the eyes of the law, you are a man who lived beyond his means and reached into the company till to catch up. By tomorrow morning, this invoice becomes a matter of public record. Unless, of course, you'd like to discuss the main property." Julian felt a surge of heat crawl up his neck. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling. He needed a record of this, a digital anchor to hold on to before the tide of Lawrence's influence pulled him under. He tapped the voice memo icon, his thumb hovering over the red circle. "Say it again," Julian challenged, his voice gaining a brittle edge. "Tell me you're extorting me for the deed to the cliffs. Let's see how the auditors like that recording." Lawrence didn't move, but the air in the room shifted. He didn't have to raise his voice. He simply looked toward the shadow by the door. Michael Davis, a mountain of a man with a shaved head and a tactical watch that ticked with a sharp, metallic click, 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 stepped into the light. The security guard's presence was a physical weight, the smell of gun oil and peppermint gum trailing behind him. "Mr. Miller asked you to put the phone away, Julian," Michael said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't wait for an answer. He lunged, his large hand closing around Julian's wrist with the force of a hydraulic press. Julian reacted on instinct, a frantic burst of energy born from years of being cornered. He grabbed his heavy aluminum architecture drafting tube from the desk, a sturdy, 3-foot cylinder that felt solid and cold in his grip. As Michael pulled him forward, Julian swung the tube in a short, jagged arc. The metal connected with the guard's ribs with a dull thud, sending a vibration up Julian's arm. Michael grunted, his grip loosening just enough for Julian to wrench his arm free. The office became a blur of motion. Julian scrambled around the desk, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He saw it then, the original property deed for the main estate, tucked into a leather folio near Lawrence's right hand. It was the only thing that mattered, the only piece of ground Lawrence couldn't yet claim. Subverted. Julian lunged across the mahogany, his fingers brushing the cool, heavy paper of the deed. This was the win. If he had the physical document, he could disappear, find a lawyer outside of his father's sphere of influence, and prove the chain of custody. Lawrence's eyes widened, a rare flash of genuine surprise breaking his mask of indifference. Julian snatched the folio and tucked it under his arm, his breathing ragged and sharp. He felt a surge of triumph, a rush of adrenaline that made the world seem bright and clear. He had outplayed the master. He had the leverage. "I have it," Julian panted, backing toward the door as Michael struggled to regain his footing, clutching his side. "I have the deed, Lawrence. You can't file for a transfer without the original, and you're never seeing this again." Lawrence didn't chase him. He didn't even stand up. A slow, thin smile spread across his face, one that didn't reach his eyes. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Julian. You think a piece of paper makes you the owner? You think I'm that unprepared?" Julian felt the weight of the folio in his hand, the texture of the fine parchment through the leather. He felt safe. He felt like he had finally won a round in a lifelong fight. He turned to the door, ready to bolt into the hallway and lose himself in the crowd of the gala happening downstairs. He could almost taste the cold Chicago night air, the freedom of the street. 1 step, 2 steps, he was at the threshold. The heavy oak door swung open before he could touch the handle. Robert Sterling stood there, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, smelling of expensive tobacco and old, dusty law books. He looked at Julian with a patronizing sadness, then slowly began to crack his knuckles. Thumb to pinky, left hand, then right. Pop. Pop, pop, asterisk. "Julian, son," Sterling said, his voice like velvet over gravel. "I'm glad I caught you. It saves us the trouble of the process server." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a blue-backed legal document, holding it out with a steady hand. Julian froze. "Robert? What is this?" "I have the deed. He's trying to steal the land." "Actually," Sterling said, leaning in to touch Julian's forearm, his unblinking eyes locking onto Julian's. "That folio you're holding is now evidence in a theft investigation. And this," he tapped the blue paper, "is a preliminary injunction. We filed it an hour ago. It freezes the title of the main property pending the resolution of the $1.2 million embezzlement suit against you. That deed in your hand? It's a useless piece of paper now. You can't sell it. You can't borrow against it. And if you leave this room with it, I'll have Michael call the police to report a robbery." The world tilted. The triumph Julian had felt seconds ago turned into a cold, leaden weight in his stomach. He looked from Sterling to his father. They had known he would go for the deed. They had baited the trap with the very thing he valued most, using his own desperation to create a criminal paper trail. The deed wasn't his shield. It was the weight that would sink him. He was standing in a room with two men who owned the law, holding a stolen document, facing a debt he couldn't pay. He hadn't escaped. He had just walked deeper into the cage. 48 hours, Julian, Lawrence said, his voice cutting through the ringing in Julian's ears. He stood up, smoothing his white shirt, number 12 in his rotation, though Julian was the only one who would know that. That's how long I'll wait before I sell your debt to a collection agency. You know the ones I mean. The kind that don't care about structural integrity. They'll strip your credit to the bone. You'll never design so much as a doghouse in this city again. Julian backed away, the injunction crinkling in his other hand. He felt the walls of the office closing in, the heavy oak paneling vibrating with the low thrum of the party outside. He turned and fled, not because he was free, but because he couldn't bear to look at the symmetry of his father's desk for another second. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his voice a frantic whisper. 1, 2, 3, 4. He needed to know where the floor was. He needed to find a place where the air didn't smell like his father. The Chicago night was biting, a damp cold that seeped through his blazer as he sprinted toward his car. He didn't go home. Home was the first place they would look. Instead, he drove to Amanda's apartment, a small third-floor walk-up in Wicker Park, where the windows were always drafty, but the doors felt solid. When he reached her floor, he stopped. The door was ajar, the wood around the lock splintered into jagged white teeth. The smell of ozone and broken plaster hit him first. "Amanda?" he called out, his voice trembling. The apartment was a graveyard of his own making. His architectural models, months of work, delicate balsa wood and plexiglass structures, had been crushed underfoot. The miniature skyscrapers lay like fallen soldiers on the hardwood. The sofa had been sliced open, the stuffing spilling out like synthetic guts. He found Amanda in the kitchen, sitting on a stool with her back to the wall, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest. She didn't look at the door. She was staring at a single glass figurine on the counter, a small crystalline bird Julian had given her. It was perfectly centered, the only thing in the room that hadn't been touched. They didn't take anything, she whispered, her voice hollow. They just showed me they could get in. Julian knelt beside her, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away. The rejection stung worse than the threat of the debt. "I'm so sorry, Amanda. I didn't think he'd come here. I didn't think he'd go this far." "He didn't do this, Julian," she said, finally looking at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face a mask of exhaustion. A man came by. He wore a suit. He was very polite. "He told me you owed some people a lot of money and that it would be a shame if the structural integrity of my life was compromised. He left a card for a debt collector." Julian picked up the card from the counter. It was plain, black ink on white cardstock. Apex Recovery Solutions. No address, no phone number. Just a logo of a hawk circling a silhouette. He stayed the night, or what was left of it, sitting on the floor with his back to the door while Amanda slept fitfully on the stripped mattress. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the radiator felt like a footstep. He realized then that Lawrence wasn't just trying to take his money or his land. He was trying to erase the very concept of safety from Julian's mind. The next morning, the harassment turned surgical. Julian walked to the parking lot where he'd left his car, only to find it slumped like a wounded animal. All 4 tires had been sliced with a precision that was terrifying. Clean, vertical gashes that suggested a steady hand and a sharp blade. Tucked under the windshield wiper, was a dead sparrow. Its neck snapped, its small, sightless eyes staring up at the gray Chicago sky. He didn't call the police. He knew Sterling would have the report intercepted before the ink was dry. He took a cab to a parking garage near the Loop, a cavernous concrete maze where he'd kept an old SUV registered in his grandmother's name. It was his last tether to a world Lawrence didn't control. The garage was freezing, the air thick with the smell of damp concrete and old exhaust. Julian's footsteps echoed, a lonely, rhythmic sound. 1, 2, 3. He reached the third level, the yellow sodium lights flickering with a high-pitched whine that set his teeth on edge. He saw his SUV, a dusty black Jeep tucked into a corner spot. He fumbled for his keys, his breath misting in the air. "Mr. Miller?" The voice came from behind a concrete pillar. Two men stepped out. They weren't thugs like Michael. They wore cheap, ill-fitting suits and carried clipboards. One of them, a wiry man named Stephen, was picking at his cuticles, his thumb raw and bleeding. He was humming a low, tuneless dirge under his breath. "We have some additional papers for you, Julian," Stephen said, his voice twitchy and high. "Robert Sterling wants to make sure you've been properly served with the amended complaint." "I've been served," Julian said, backing toward the Jeep. "Stay away from me." "See, that's the thing," the second man, Kevin, said. He had broad shoulders and a permanent sneer. "We need a signature for the delivery. Just making it easy on everyone, you know. No hard feelings, you know." Stephen reached into his jacket, but he didn't pull out a pen. He pulled out a taser, the black plastic gleaming under the flickering lights. The snap hiss of the electrical arc echoed through the garage, a jagged blue spark that illuminated the dark corners. Julian didn't wait. He lunged for the Jeep, his fingers clawing at the door handle. He heard the pop of the taser, felt the wind of the probes as they whistled past his ear and thudded into the car's upholstery. He scrambled into the driver's seat, slamming the lock just as Kevin's fist hammered against the glass. "Open the door, Julian. You're making this difficult, you know." Julian cranked the engine. It groaned, sputtered, then roared to life. He slammed the vehicle into reverse, the tires shrieking against the oily concrete. He saw Stephen in the rearview mirror, still humming that horrific tune, reloading the taser with practiced ease. He floored it toward the exit, the Jeep's engine roaring in the confined space. The security gate at the end of the ramp was already beginning to descend, a heavy iron curtain meant to keep out the world. "Go, go, go," Julian hissed, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He didn't slow down. He saw the gap closing, 4 feet, 3 feet. He ducked his head as the Jeep barreled through. There was a horrific, grinding shriek of metal on metal as the bottom of the gate caught the roof of the SUV, shearing the luggage rack off and peeling back the steel like a sardine can. Glass showered the interior, stinging Julian's neck. But he didn't stop. He burst out into the blinding daylight of the street, leaving the gate crumpled and the process servers behind. He drove until the engine temp redlined, finally pulling into the overgrown driveway of a small, nondescript house in the suburbs, a property his grandmother had used as a rental years ago. He sat in the ruined car for a long time, the wind whistling through the hole in the roof, shaking with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. He needed something. A weapon. Not a drafting tube or a car, but something that could actually hurt a man like Lawrence. He remembered the jewelry box. It was a small, velvet-lined thing he'd salvaged from his grandmother's estate before the lawyers moved in. He'd kept it because it smelled like her, lavender and rain. But as he sat in the quiet of the rental house, he looked at it with an architect's eye. The box was a cube, 6 inches on each side. But the internal depth didn't match the external height. There was a gap of nearly an inch. He took a screwdriver from the Jeep's glove box and began to pry at the velvet lining. It resisted, the old glue stubborn and dry. Finally, the false bottom popped up with a dry crack. There, nestled in a bed of gray foam, were 3 black flash drives. Each one was marked with 4 distinct indentations, as if Sarah had tapped them 4 times with a heavy ring before hiding them away. Julian's heart skipped. He took his laptop from his bag, the one he'd kept off the network since the office, and plugged in the first drive. The screen flickered, then a password prompt appeared. He tried her birthday. No. He tried the address of the main house. No. Then he remembered the way she used to walk through the garden, tapping the gate, the bench, the door. He typed 4444. The drive opened. It wasn't a collection of memories. It was a ledger. Thousands of lines of data, offshore account numbers, and wire transfer confirmations. Julian scrolled through the names, his breath catching. Miller Holdings, Shell Tech Alpha, Blue Horizon Equities. He saw the pattern immediately. Lawrence wasn't just wealthy, he was a conduit. He had been siphoning millions from the family estate for over a decade, moving money through a labyrinth of accounts to cover massive losses in a series of failed real estate gambles in Macau. The $1.2 million invoice he'd handed Julian wasn't a lesson. It was the exact amount Lawrence needed to bridge a gap in his latest audit before the federal regulators took notice. Lawrence was broke. The granite-jawed pillar of the community was a hollow shell, held together by forged signatures and Julian's inheritance. "You're a ghost, Dad," Julian whispered to the empty room. "You're already dead. You just haven't fallen over yet." But the realization brought no relief. A cornered predator was more dangerous than a hungry one. Julian knew he had the evidence to ruin Lawrence, but Lawrence had the power to make sure Julian didn't live long enough to use it. He needed to liquidate the land. He needed the cash to hire a security team and a legal firm that Sterling couldn't buy. He reached out to Richard Thompson, a land liquidator his grandmother had trusted. They met at a roadside diner 3 hours north of the city. The rain was a relentless gray curtain, blurring the world outside the fogged windows. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and wet wool. Thompson sat in a corner booth, his weathered face lit by the flickering neon of a Budweiser sign. "Pop always said a man who drinks his coffee black has nothing to hide," Thompson said, staring into his mug. He didn't look at Julian. "But you, Julian, you look like a man who's hiding from his own shadow." "I need to sell the main acreage, Richard, quickly. I don't care about the market rate. I just need a buyer who can move in 24 hours. Thompson finally looked up, his eyes filled with a weary pity. He slid a folder across the sticky table. "I tried, boy. I put out the feelers to my best buyers. But the title came back flagged. Your father filed a lease pendens yesterday afternoon. The property is legally frozen. You couldn't sell a square inch of that dirt if your life depended on it." Julian felt the air leave his lungs. He can't do that. The injunction was temporary. "In this county, your father is the law," Thompson said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "He didn't just freeze the land. He's telling people you're a flight risk, that you're trying to sell stolen assets." Julian stood up, the chairs screeching against the linoleum. He felt the walls of the diner pressing in. He was being squeezed, the space for him to exist narrowing with every hour. He drove to the main property. It was a desperate, illogical move, but he needed to stand on the ground that belonged to him. He needed to feel the granite under his feet. The cliffs were shrouded in a thick, salt-heavy mist. The Atlantic crashed against the rocks below with a thunderous, rhythmic boom that vibrated in Julian's marrow. He walked to the edge, the wind whipping his hair, the scent of brine and wet earth filling his senses. It's a long way down, isn't it? Julian spun around. Lawrence stood 10 feet away, flanked by Michael and another guard. Lawrence's silver hair was dampened by the mist, but he still looked perfectly composed, his hand resting on the handle of a sleek, silver tablet. "You shouldn't have come here, Julian," Lawrence said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the waves. "This land is a graveyard for people who don't know how to hold on to what they have." "I know about the accounts, Lawrence," Julian shouted, his voice cracking. "I know you're insolvent. I know Shell Tech Alpha is a front for the Macau losses." Lawrence's face didn't change, but his eyes darkened. He nodded to Michael. The guard moved with terrifying speed. Before Julian could react, Michael's massive hand was around his throat, pinning him against a gnarled pine tree at the cliff's edge. The bark bit into Julian's back, and the sound of the waves seemed to grow louder, a hungry roar. Lawrence stepped forward, holding the tablet. "I don't care what you think you know. Information is only valuable if you can tell it to someone who cares. And right now, the only person who cares about you is me." He held the tablet in front of Julian's face. The screen showed a property transfer document, the legal language a blur of gray and black. At the bottom was a glowing blue box for a biometric signature. "Press your thumb to the pad, Julian," Lawrence commanded. "Transfer the deed to Miller Holdings. I'll pay off the debt, I'll drop the suit, and I'll give you enough money to disappear to Europe. You can be an architect in Paris. You can be whoever you want, as long as you aren't a Miller." "No," Julian gasped, struggling against Michael's grip. Lawrence grabbed Julian's right hand, his fingers surprisingly strong. He began to force Julian's thumb toward the glowing sensor. "Don't be a martyr for a pile of rocks. You're leaning, Julian. You're about to fall. Just sign and it's over." The sensor was inches away. Julian could see the red light of the scanner, the digital eye waiting to steal his legacy. He felt the heat of Michael's breath, the smell of peppermint gum. With a sudden, violent twist, Julian bit down on Michael's forearm. The guard roared in pain, his grip slackening for a split second. Julian drove his elbow into Michael's solar plexus and lunged to the side, his feet skidding on the wet grass. He scrambled toward the ledge, the mist swallowing him. He heard Lawrence shouting, the sound of heavy boots on the granite. He didn't look back. He slid down a narrow, rocky crevice he'd explored as a child, his fingernails tearing as he clawed at the stone. He tucked himself into a small overhang, his heart drumming a frantic rhythm. The rain began to fall in earnest then, a cold, lashing downpour that turned the cliffs into a slick, deadly maze. He heard the guards calling his name, their voices distorted by the wind. "He's not worth it," Lawrence's voice echoed, sounding thin and old. "The tide is coming in. Let the water have him." Julian huddled in the dark, the spray of the ocean soaking his clothes. He waited for hours, until the voices faded, and the only sound was the eternal, crushing weight of the sea. When he finally crawled out, the world was a bruised purple. He made it back to his car, his body a map of aches and bruises. His phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a call from his mother. "Julian?" Catherine's voice was a ragged sob. "Julian, please, you have to stop." "Mom, what happened? Are you okay?" Robert said you were going to jail. He said if I didn't help, they'd take everything. The house, my mother's things." She let out a long, theatrical sigh that turned into a wail. "I signed it, Julian. I signed the affidavit." Julian's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. What affidavit, Mom? The one saying Sarah, that your grandmother wasn't in her right mind when she wrote the will, that she was confused, that the land should have gone to Lawrence all along. I'm so sorry, baby. I just wanted it to be over. Julian leaned his head against the wheel. The betrayal was a physical blow, a dull ache in his chest that made it hard to breathe. With that one signature, the deed he'd stolen, the ledgers he'd found, it was all neutralized. If the will was invalid, Julian was a squatter on his own land and a thief for taking the company's money. You killed me, Mom, he whispered. Milk, eggs, flour. She started to recite, her voice drifting into the disassociated rhythm of her grandmother's grocery list. Sugar, tea, salt. Julian hung up. He was a man with no land, no money, and no family. He drove to an old, off-grid hunting cabin 3 miles into the woods, a place Lawrence had forgotten he owned. It was a skeletal structure of silver wood and groaning floorboards, the windows rattling in the wind. He needed a moment to think, to find the one structural flaw in Lawrence's plan. He sat in the dark, the only light coming from the glowing screen of his laptop. He looked at the $1.2 million invoice again. $1,242,650.12. He pulled up the ledgers from the flash drive. He searched for the number. There it was. A wire transfer from Shell Tech Alpha to an account in the Cayman Islands. $1,242,650.12. Lawrence hadn't just picked a number. He had used the exact amount of his most recent illegal transfer as the basis for the fraud against Julian. He was using Julian as a human shield for a specific federal crime. The sound of a siren cut through the trees. Not the low rhythmic hum of a security guard, but the sharp, yelping wail of a state police cruiser. Subverted. Julian felt a sudden, sharp relief. This was it. The police were here. He would show them the flash drives, show them the invoice, and the whole house of cards would come down. He had the evidence. He was the victim. He stood up, smoothing his hair, preparing his statement. He would walk out with his hands up, a citizen seeking protection from a criminal father. He could almost feel the weight lifting off his shoulders. The law was finally here to do its job. He walked toward the front door, the blue and red lights dancing across the cabin's walls. He could see the silhouettes of officers moving through the trees, their flashlights cutting through the dark. "I'm in here," Julian called out, his voice steady. "I have evidence of financial fraud. I'm coming out." He reached for the door handle, a smile of genuine hope touching his lips. He was going to be safe. The door didn't open. He heard the heavy metallic clack of a deadbolt being thrown from the outside. Then another, and a third. "Julian Miller," a voice boomed over a megaphone. "This is the state police. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of grand larceny, aggravated assault, and interstate flight to avoid prosecution. Come out with your hands behind your head." Julian froze. He looked at the door, then at the windows. He saw Robert Sterling standing near the police cruiser, talking to an officer. Sterling was holding a gold watch, the one he'd given Julian for integrity, and checking the time with a predatory calm. "He's armed and unstable," Sterling shouted, his voice carrying easily through the thin walls. "He attacked his father on the cliffs. He's been siphoning funds for months." The truth hit Julian like a physical blow. The police weren't there to save him. Lawrence hadn't just framed him for a debt. He had used Sterling to build a criminal profile that turned Julian into a dangerous fugitive. Every move Julian had made, taking the deed, biting Michael, fleeing to the cabin, had been factored into the script. He wasn't the victim, he was the suspect. And in a remote cabin with no witnesses, the police wouldn't be looking for a folder of offshore accounts. They'd be looking for a reason to use force. He was trapped in a box of his own making. And the man who built it was outside, waiting to watch it burn. The sirens continued to wail, a deafening rhythmic scream that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards beneath Julian's feet. He looked down. The cabin was old, built on a pier and beam foundation that had settled unevenly over the decades. He remembered his father's architectural lessons, the way Lawrence would point out the weak points in a structure just before he tore it down. Every building has a secret, Julian. A place where the weight doesn't want to be. Julian dropped to his knees. He felt the floorboards, searching for the soft spot near the hearth. He kicked at a rotted section of the joist, the wood splintering with a wet crunch. He kicked again, his boots finding purchase in the darkness. He slid into the crawl space just as the front door was kicked in. The sound of heavy boots thudded above him, the dust sifting down into his eyes. "Clear!" a voice shouted. Julian scrambled through the dirt and spiderwebs, his breathing shallow. He found the old landline data port, a relic of a time before cell towers. He plugged in his laptop, the battery light blinking a desperate red. He didn't send the files to a lawyer. He didn't send them to a news station. He uploaded the entire drive, the ledgers, the offshore accounts, and the $1.2 million invoice, directly to the IRS whistleblower portal. He tagged it with Lawrence's social security number and the corporate EIN for Miller Holdings. The progress bar crawled. 10%, 20%. Above him, he heard Michael's voice. "He's not in the rooms. Check the perimeter." 30%, 40%. Julian watched the screen, his heart hammering. He realized then that the invoice wasn't just a weapon. It was a map. By listing the exact dollar amount of the illegal transfer, Lawrence had provided the missing link that federal investigators needed to tie the offshore accounts to his domestic business. Julian hadn't just found evidence. He had found the key to a federal lock. 50%, 70%, 90%. Upload complete. Julian closed the laptop and crawled toward the back of the foundation, pushing through a loose lattice screen. He emerged into the cold, wet woods, the smell of pine and rain-drenched earth filling his lungs. He didn't run. He walked toward the tree line and waited. 10 minutes later, the dynamic shifted. Another set of sirens approached, not the yelp of the state police, but the deep, authoritative roar of federal black and whites. Julian watched from the shadows as a group of men in windbreakers with IRSCI and FBI stenciled on the back stepped into the light. They didn't go for the cabin. They went straight to Robert Sterling and Lawrence Miller. "Lawrence Miller?" A woman's voice carried through the clearing. "We have a warrant for your arrest for tax evasion, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud." Lawrence stood frozen, his hand still resting on the parallel line of his blazer. For the first time in his life, the symmetry was broken. The federal agents didn't care about his name or his office. They saw the numbers, and the numbers didn't lie. Sterling tried to speak, his knuckles popping in a frantic, rhythmic sequence. Pop, pop, pop. But an agent simply turned him around and snapped the cuffs onto his wrists. Julian stepped out from the trees, his hands raised, but his head held high. 2 weeks later, Julian sat in a small, sunlit office in a neutral federal building. He looked across the table at a woman in a sharp gray suit. "The evidence you provided is extensive, Mr. Miller," the agent said. "It's rare we get a whistleblower who provides the roadmap and the fuel at the same time. I want a total severance," Julian said. his voice quiet but firm. I relinquish my claim to the main property. I relinquish any inheritance from the Miller estate. In exchange, I want legal immunity for my mother and a permanent, federally enforced restraining order against my father and Robert Sterling. The agent nodded. We can accommodate that. Your father is looking at 20 years. Mr. Sterling is looking at 15. They won't be in a position to bother anyone for a long time. Julian signed the papers. He felt no triumph, only a strange, hollow lightness. He was a man with nothing left to his name, and for the first time in 28 years, he knew exactly where the floor was. He moved to Chicago, not to the high-rises of the Loop, but to a small, sparse apartment in a quiet neighborhood where the trees lined the streets and the neighbors didn't know his name. He started his own firm. Miller Architectural Design. He didn't have a mahogany desk or leather chair. He had a drafting table and a single clear window. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It was from his mother, forwarded through a series of lawyers. Inside was a check for $500. Gas money, the note said in her shaky, looping handwriting. I'm so sorry, baby. I hope you're safe. Julian looked at the check. He thought of the grocery lists, the sandalwood cologne, and the sound of the waves against the granite cliffs. He slowly, methodically, tore the check into 4 equal pieces. He walked to the window and looked out at the city. The sun was setting, casting long, geometric shadows across the brick buildings. It was a beautiful view, one he had designed for himself. He turned back to his drafting table and picked up his pencil. He didn't count the steps as he walked. He didn't need to. He was finally off the ledger.